Many people believe leaders are created by titles, by appointments, by the moment someone is placed in front of a group and given authority over it. The belief is intuitive. It fits the way organizations are structured, the way institutions operate, the way most people were taught to understand hierarchy. You earn a position, you receive the title, the leadership follows. But if you observe carefully, not just casually, but with genuine attention over time, the picture becomes considerably more complicated than that. In almost every group, organization, and professional environment, there are people whose actual influence bears little relationship to their formal position. They may hold a middle rank or no rank at all. They may not be the loudest voice in the room. They may not be the one presenting the strategy or delivering the announcement. But when circumstances become uncertain, when decisions are difficult, when the group is unsure of its direction, people orient toward these individuals. They look to them for a read on the situation. They weight their opinions differently. They trust their judgment in ways that the organizational chart does not fully explain. And then there are people at the top of formal hierarchies who are technically in charge, but functionally disconnected from real influence. People follow their directives when required and privately question their judgment constantly. Their authority is procedural. Their leadership, in any meaningful sense, is absent. The difference between these two types of people is not talent in the conventional sense. It is not charisma, though the more charismatic person is often more visible. It is not luck, though luck shapes every career at the margins. It is something that develops more slowly, more quietly, and more durably than any of those things. Have you ever noticed how some individuals quietly influence the direction of a group without ever formally being in charge? How some people, when they speak, tend to shift the energy of a room in a way that has nothing to do with volume or forcefulness. How others, despite impressive titles, seem to leave people essentially unchanged by their presence. The explanation for this is not mysterious, but it is invisible in the way that gradual development is always invisible until it is not. Leadership in its most durable form is not the result of one moment. It is not the result of a promotion, a dramatic decision, or a single display of competence. It is the result of habits, specific patterns of thinking, communication, and behavior, practiced consistently over long periods, that gradually shape how a person moves through situations and how others perceive them. By the time someone becomes genuinely influential, the kind of person others trust and naturally orient toward, that influence is usually the product of years of quiet, mostly unobserved habit. Understanding those habits does not require a theory of personality or a framework for classifying people into types. It requires only a careful observation of what these individuals actually do, day after day, in ordinary circumstances, because the habits that build real leadership are mostly practiced in ordinary circumstances. They are not reserved for high-stakes moments. They are present in how someone handles a small misunderstanding, how they approach an unclear situation, how they communicate when they have nothing particularly important to say. It begins with something that sounds almost too simple to take seriously: the habit of thinking before speaking. In a culture that rewards rapid response, verbal fluency, and the appearance of always having an answer, the person who pauses before responding can seem, at first glance, like someone who is slow or uncertain. But observe this over time, and a different picture emerges: the person who consistently pauses, genuinely processes the information in front of them before responding, tends to say things that are more accurate, more useful, and more clearly reasoned than the person who speaks first and organizes their thoughts while speaking. This habit is not about being slow. It is about respecting the content of communication enough to ensure what you contribute is actually worth contributing. And over time, it produces a reputation. People begin to notice that when this person speaks, what they say tends to hold up. It tends to be thought through. It tends to account for angles that others missed in their speed. The reliability of their communication creates a kind of gravity. Others begin to actually listen, rather than simply waiting for their own turn to speak. The habit of thinking before speaking also prevents a class of errors that derail credibility more frequently than most people realize. The reactive statement made in frustration, the overconfident assessment made without full information, the impulsive agreement made to avoid conflict in the moment that creates a larger problem later. These errors are common, and they are almost entirely preventable with a modest amount of discipline around the timing of responses. The person who develops this discipline avoids a significant source of credibility damage that others accumulate continuously without noticing the pattern. But something else quietly shapes leadership over time. Alongside the discipline of speech is the discipline of listening. Genuine listening, not the performance of attention while actually preparing a response. Most people are not good listeners. They believe they are because they maintain eye contact and produce affirmative sounds at appropriate intervals. But genuine listening requires something more effortful than physical attendance in a conversation. It requires the temporary suspension of one's own perspective in order to actually receive someone else's. It requires the willingness to be genuinely uncertain about what the other person means until they have finished expressing it, rather than mapping their words onto a conclusion that was formed halfway through their second sentence. The people who develop genuinely good listening habits gain something that most of their peers do not have: accurate information about what others actually think and experience. This sounds modest, but its implications are significant. In any group, the quality of decisions is limited by the quality of information available to the decision maker. If you cannot accurately receive what others are communicating, if your listening is primarily a filter that confirms what you already believe, you are working with distorted information, and your decisions will reflect that distortion. The good listener also produces a particular effect in the people they engage with. Being genuinely heard is an uncommon experience. Most people move through their days speaking to audiences of partial attention. When they encounter someone who actually listens, who receives their communication fully, asks clarifying questions rather than immediately asserting a competing view, and demonstrates that what was said has actually been processed, the effect is disarming. It creates a quality of connection and trust that superficially more impressive social performances fail to produce. This is one reason why genuine listeners often have influence that seems disproportionate to their visible social skills. They are not necessarily the most articulate or the most assertive, but they are trusted. People speak more openly with them. They are brought into conversations that others are not included in. They are the person others want in the room when something important needs to be worked through. Not because they are expected to have the answer, but because the process of thinking alongside them tends to produce clarity. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate: the habit of taking responsibility rather than assigning blame. When situations go wrong, and in any meaningful endeavor, things go wrong with regularity, the dominant response in most groups is some version of liability management. Who made the error? Who failed to do what was needed? Who is responsible for the problem? These questions are not always driven by genuine interest in learning. They are often driven by the desire to establish that one was not at fault. The social dynamic of groups under pressure is frequently one of deflection, of each person quietly identifying why the failure belonged to someone else's domain. The person who does not participate in this dynamic, who, when something goes wrong, focuses their attention on understanding the problem and determining what can be done, rather than on establishing their own innocence, stands out in a way that accumulates steadily over time, not because self-sacrifice is itself a leadership virtue, but because accountability is a form of honesty, and honesty at the group level is rare and therefore valuable. When someone consistently says, whether implicitly or explicitly, "Here is my contribution to the problem, and here is what I can do differently," rather than locating the problem entirely in external factors, several things happen simultaneously. The group has a model for productive post-failure behavior. The culture gradually shifts toward learning rather than defensiveness, and the individual accumulates a reputation for intellectual honesty that becomes one of the most durable forms of trust available. People trust those who are accountable not because accountability is morally impressive, but because it is functionally reliable. If someone is willing to acknowledge when they contribute to a problem, then their assessments of situations are more likely to be accurate. They are not distorting their analysis to protect their own position. Their account of what is happening can be taken at closer to face value. In a landscape full of strategically managed self-presentation, that kind of straightforwardness is genuinely valuable. And this is where influence begins to grow. The connection between personal accountability and group confidence is more direct than most people recognize. When a leader, formal or informal, takes responsibility clearly and without drama, the people around them experience a particular kind of relief. The situation may still be difficult. The problem may still require significant effort to resolve. But the anxious social energy of the group, the undercurrent of who is going to be blamed, who will deflect toward whom, dissipates. What remains is the practical question of what needs to be done, and practical questions, separated from social anxiety, are much easier for groups to work through productively. The person who creates this condition consistently becomes, over time, someone that others want present when situations are difficult, not because they have the right answer, but because their presence changes the emotional texture of the group in a way that makes good work more possible. Most people overlook this habit. The relationship between composure and credibility is something that most people understand in theory, but very few have actually examined in their own behavior with any rigor. When circumstances are difficult, when the environment is uncertain, when the stakes are high, when the outcome is genuinely unclear, most people experience a measurable shift in their behavior. Their communication becomes either more aggressive or more withdrawn. Their decision-making becomes faster and less careful, driven by the desire to relieve the discomfort of uncertainty rather than by a sober assessment of the situation. Their tolerance for ambiguity contracts, They want resolution, any resolution, because the sustained pressure of not knowing is genuinely uncomfortable. The person who remains composed under these conditions does something specific with their attention. They do not attempt to deny the difficulty of the situation or perform a false calm that masks genuine anxiety. They simply maintain their analytical process in conditions where others have abandoned it. They continue asking what is actually known versus what is being assumed. They continue evaluating options against the actual criteria that should govern the decision rather than against the criterion of what would feel relieving. They continue communicating clearly rather than reactively. This composure is not natural for most people. It is developed. It is the product of repeatedly practicing the habit of noticing when pressure is affecting one's thinking and making a deliberate choice to return to a more deliberate mode of operation over time. This practice creates a reliable capacity, the ability to maintain the quality of thinking in precisely the conditions where that quality matters most. The effect on a group is significant. Composure is contagious in approximately the same way panic is contagious. When the most visible person in a situation demonstrates calm, analytical engagement with a problem, the surrounding people's own anxiety is partially regulated by that signal. Their ability to think and contribute improves. When the visible person is panicking or deflecting or exuding unfocused urgency, the surrounding people's anxiety is amplified. The quality of the group's thinking degrades exactly when it most needs to be functional. This is one reason why composure is one of the most practically valuable leadership habits available. It is not about appearing unaffected. It is not about suppressing genuine concern. It is about maintaining the functional quality of engagement that the situation requires, and about the downstream effect that has on the thinking of everyone else involved. But something else quietly shapes leadership over time. The habit of clear communication deserves examination, separate from the general notion of being articulate. Many people are articulate. They use language fluently, structure sentences well, and express themselves without obvious difficulty. But articulate is not the same as clear. Clarity in communication is a different quality, and it requires a different discipline. Clear communication begins with clear thinking. Before you can express an idea precisely, you need to understand it precisely. The most common source of unclear communication is not poor language ability. It is imprecise thinking that has not been examined before being expressed. The person who speaks fluently, but without prior precision, often produces a large volume of words that circles around an idea without ever landing on it. The listener follows the language and understands each sentence individually, but finishes the exchange uncertain about what, exactly, was being communicated. The discipline of clear communication, therefore, begins before speaking. It begins with the practice of determining, as specifically as possible, what point actually needs to be made. What is the central claim? What is the specific decision that needs to be made? What is the single most important thing this person needs to understand? Answering these questions before communicating, rather than discovering the answer through the process of speaking, produces a fundamentally different quality of output. It produces communication that lands, that produces actual shared understanding, rather than communication that occupies time without generating clarity. Over time, the person who communicates with consistent clarity develops a reputation as someone who is useful to have in complex discussions. Not because they are the most knowledgeable, but because their presence tends to generate precision. They have a habit of asking the question that cuts through the accumulated ambiguity of a conversation to the actual issue that needs to be resolved. They have a habit of naming what is happening in a room when the room is avoiding naming it. They contribute a quality of directness that most groups need and most individuals are too socially cautious to provide. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate. Reliability, not as an abstract character virtue, but as a specific operational habit that shapes everything around it. Reliability means that what you say you will do and what you actually do are, over time, the same thing. This sounds like a minimum standard, but observe any professional environment carefully, and you will find that it is not a minimum standard at all. The gap between stated intentions and actual follow-through is, for most people and most organizations, substantial. Commitments are made with genuine intention and abandoned under pressure. Timelines are agreed upon and quietly allowed to slip. Agreements are reached in meetings and then reinterpreted when the meeting is over. This pattern is so common that most people have unconsciously adjusted for it. They assume a discount rate on every commitment they receive. They plan around the probability of non-delivery. The person who does not fit this pattern, who has a consistent record of doing what they said they would do, delivering when they committed to deliver, following through when circumstances made it difficult, stands out with a clarity that is entirely disproportionate to the simplicity of the behavior. They stand out because they are genuinely unusual, and the effect accumulates. Every time they follow through, the credit of reliability in the minds of those around them increases. The confidence that others place in their commitments grows. Eventually, their word itself becomes a resource. When they commit to something, the recipients of that commitment can genuinely plan on it. That ability to make a commitment that others can actually rely on is a form of organizational power that no title conveys and no personality trait produces. It is built entirely through repeated behavior over time. Reliability also has a less obvious effect on the individual themselves. When you have a consistent record of following through, you become more careful about what you commit to. You know from experience that you will be held to it, not primarily by external enforcement, but by your own internal standard. This carefulness produces a discipline of commitment, making that prevents the overextension, the scattered energy, and the reputational damage that characterizes the person who agrees to everything and delivers inconsistently. Most people overlook this habit. The way individuals respond to uncertainty, not crisis but ordinary, everyday uncertainty, is one of the most telling indicators of long-term leadership capacity. Most situations that groups face are not crises. They are simply unclear. The path forward is not obvious. The information needed to make a confident decision is incomplete. Multiple reasonable interpretations of the situation are available, and different people hold different ones. In these conditions, which are the conditions of most meaningful work, the dominant tendency is to either force premature clarity or to delay indefinitely while waiting for certainty that may never arrive. The person who neither forces nor delays, but who creates structure from available information while explicitly acknowledging what remains unknown, performs a function that groups need constantly and find rarely. They make it possible to move forward without pretending to know more than is actually known. They create a working framework enough direction to coordinate action, while building in the flexibility to revise as new information arrives. This requires a specific kind of intellectual discipline, the willingness to make a decision with incomplete information, to commit to a direction provisionally while remaining genuinely open to revision, and to communicate that provisional quality without it becoming an excuse for inaction. It is the opposite of both false certainty and perpetual indecision, and it is a skill that must be practiced deliberately, because neither of the opposing defaults requires effort. They are both, in their different ways, resolutions to the discomfort of uncertainty. The person who develops this capacity becomes invaluable in the conditions of genuine uncertainty that characterize any significant undertaking, not because they always know the answer, but because they can create productive forward movement in the absence of the answer while maintaining the group's capacity to learn and adjust. This is leadership in its most fundamental operational form, not vision, not inspiration, but the practical ability to coordinate sustained, directed effort in conditions of incomplete information. And this is where influence begins to grow in environments that others find paralyzing. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate. Preparation, not as an occasion, specific event, not the frantic review of materials the night before a presentation, but as a consistent, ongoing habit. The distinction matters because preparation, as habit, produces a fundamentally different relationship to situations than preparation as event. The person who consistently prepares, who has spent continuous time building their understanding of the domains they operate in, developing their analytical tools, learning from what they observe, arrives at any given situation with a depth of background that cannot be assembled in the hours before it is needed. They have built a reservoir of knowledge and thinking that can be deployed fluidly as situations require. This depth does not always announce itself visibly. It often shows up as a quality of reading a situation quickly and accurately, or as the ability to identify which variables in a complex problem are actually most important, or as the capacity to anticipate how a decision will play out in an environment that others are still trying to understand. From the outside, this can look like natural talent or intuition. From the inside, it is the accumulated product of consistent preparation over a long period. The person who prepares consistently also handles novelty better than the person who relies on the moment capability alone, because their background is broader and deeper. New situations have more points of contact with things they already understand. They can orient faster. They can draw on analogs and patterns that provide a starting framework even in unfamiliar territory. The genuinely unprepared person, by contrast, faces truly novel situations with a much smaller set of tools and must construct everything from scratch, which is both slower and more error-prone. But something else quietly shapes leadership over time. The habit of supporting others without seeking attention for doing so is one of those behaviors that most people understand intellectually, but find genuinely difficult to sustain in practice. Organizations and groups run on visible contribution. The person who speaks in the meeting, who presents the work, who is associated with a successful outcome, this person receives the recognition. The person who helped them think through the problem, who identified the flaw in the plan before it became a failure, who provided the context that made the decision possible. This person often receives nothing visible. For most people, This asymmetry produces resentment over time, which eventually changes their behavior. They begin to make sure their contributions are visible. They begin to position themselves to receive credit. They begin to withhold the quiet support they were previously providing because it was producing no visible return. The person who does not undergo this transformation, who continues providing genuine support, regardless of visibility, not out of indifference to recognition, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what actually serves the group and the long-term environment, builds something that cannot be manufactured by strategic positioning. They build genuine goodwill, not the manufactured goodwill of the person who is publicly generous but privately calculating, but the durable goodwill of the person who has consistently made others work better without requiring acknowledgement. This goodwill, accumulated over time, produces a kind of influence that is difficult to describe precisely but unmistakable in practice. Others feel genuinely positively toward this person in a way that extends beyond their specific contributions. They advocate for them without being asked. They include them in conversations they might not formally qualify for. They extend them trust at a pace that formal relationship building cannot achieve, because the trust is not based on a calculation. It is based on genuine experience. Most people overlook this habit. The relationship between emotional stability and sustained influence is more direct than most people recognize and more difficult to develop than most people appreciate. Emotional stability does not mean emotional flatness. It does not mean the suppression of feeling or the performance of equanimity. It means the ability to experience the full range of emotional response to circumstances while maintaining a reliable quality of behavior and judgment. The emotions are present. The reactions are present, but they do not fully determine the behavior. There is a working space between the emotional input and the behavioral output that can be used for deliberate choice. Most people do not have much of this space. When something frustrating happens, the frustration determines the response. When something threatening happens, the fear determines the response. When something exciting happens, the enthusiasm determines the response. The emotional signal and the behavioral output are closely coupled, without much processing in between. This is not a character flaw. It is a developmental condition that most people simply never work to change. The person who develops genuine emotional stability, who has spent time with their own emotional patterns, who has practiced recognizing the signals and making deliberate choices rather than reacting automatically, becomes significantly more reliable under the conditions that most frequently disrupt others. They are harder to destabilize in conflict. They are less likely to make reactive decisions during periods of pressure. They are less susceptible to the social manipulation that operates primarily through emotional levers, through flattery, through threat, through the pressure of group disapproval. Their judgment is more consistent across emotional conditions because the emotional conditions have less direct authority over the judgment. For the people around them, this stability is experienced as trustworthiness, not in the narrow sense of honesty, but in the broader sense of predictability and reliability. They know what they will get from this person, regardless of conditions. The person's behavior does not shift dramatically based on what mood they happen to be in. The quality of their engagement does not fluctuate according to whether things are going well or badly for them personally. This consistency, the fact that others can form an accurate expectation of how this person will behave and trust that expectation to hold is one of the most undervalued qualities in any collaborative environment. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate. Learning from mistakes, rather than concealing them, is a habit that most people find genuinely difficult because it runs counter to the social incentives operating in almost every professional environment. In most groups, admitting error is associated with social cost. The admission creates a record. It can affect how others assess competence. It may influence decisions about who receives responsibility or advancement. Given these social dynamics, the rational short-term response is to minimize, contextualize, and quietly move past errors rather than to examine them carefully and openly. But the short-term calculation misses something important. The purpose of examining mistakes is not the admission itself. It is the learning, and the learning is the thing that, over time, produces the compounding improvement in judgment that separates people who develop continuously from people who plateau. The person who conceals errors from others may also, in the process of concealing them, avoid examining them closely themselves. The result is a pattern of repeated errors, the same underlying misjudgment, producing the same category of failure in different contexts that permanently limits performance. The person who develops the habit of examining their own mistakes honestly, not with self-punishment, but with analytical interest, extracts lessons from every significant error. They improve faster than their peers, not because they make fewer errors initially, but because they convert each error into permanent learning rather than simply enduring it and moving past it. Their trajectory is steeper. And when they are willing to acknowledge errors openly in the context of a group, to say clearly what happened, what their contribution to it was, and what they understand differently now, the effect on the group culture is significant. It creates permission for others to do the same. In a culture where error acknowledgement is common, where the norm is examination and learning rather than deflection, the group's collective improvement rate accelerates. The quality of its decisions improves. Its capacity to navigate novel challenges increases. And the person who helped create that culture accrues a particular kind of credibility. The credibility of someone who has demonstrated, repeatedly, that learning matters more to them than self-protection. And this is where influence begins to grow in ways that endure. Most people overlook how the habit of preparation extends specifically into communication. Preparing what you intend to communicate before you communicate it is different from being naturally articulate. Many naturally articulate people speak fluidly in a way that obscures rather than clarifies, because their fluency allows them to produce large volumes of language without having done the prior work of determining precisely what they are trying to convey. Prepared communication begins with a question that most people never ask before speaking: what exactly do I need this person or this group to understand or decide as a result of this exchange? Starting from that question changes everything about the communication. The irrelevant content falls away because it does not serve the central purpose. The key information gets prioritized and positioned. The language gets chosen to serve precision rather than to demonstrate fluency. And the listener receives something they can actually act on, rather than a demonstration of the speaker's knowledge that leaves them uncertain about what it means for them. This habit of prepared communication also produces a discipline in meetings, which is one of the most consistently misused forms of organizational time. The person who enters a meeting, having thought clearly about what needs to be accomplished and what their specific contribution to that purpose is, produces different quality of meeting participation than the person who arrives with no prior thought and discovers their position for the position. The process of the conversation. The former adds directed value, the latter adds volume. Over time, the person with consistently prepared communication becomes the one whose contributions shift the room, not because they speak more or speak louder, but because what they say tends to have been thought through and tends to move the conversation toward resolution, rather than simply adding material to it. But something else quietly shapes leadership over time. Understanding group dynamics, the invisible social forces that shape how groups make decisions, distribute influence, and manage conflict, is a capability that develops through observation rather than through instruction. Every group has a social structure that operates largely beneath the explicit organizational structure. There are people whose opinions carry more weight than their position warrants, and people whose opinions carry less. There are alliances and tensions that influence which ideas get considered and which are quietly set aside. There are unspoken norms about what can be said and what must remain unsaid. There are dynamics around who interrupts whom, whose contributions get acknowledged and whose get absorbed without attribution, whose uncertainty is treated as data and whose is treated as a performance issue. The person who observes these dynamics carefully, without cynicism, without manipulation, but with a genuine interest in understanding how the social environment actually operates, gains an accurate map of the group that is far more useful than the official organizational chart. They understand why certain conversations go nowhere. They understand which concerns are not being voiced explicitly, but are shaping behavior implicitly. They understand where the genuine decision-making authority lies, which may be very different from where the formal authority lies. This understanding does not primarily serve the observer's own positioning. It serves their effectiveness. When you understand the social dynamics of a group accurately, you can communicate more effectively within it. You can identify the genuine obstacles to a decision rather than the stated ones. You can structure conversations in ways that create space for important things to be said that would otherwise remain unspoken. You can navigate conflict without being surprised by its social dimensions. The person who develops this observational accuracy becomes someone that others consult when navigating difficult group dynamics, not because they are politically sophisticated in the manipulative sense, but because they understand the landscape accurately and can help others navigate it without being dominated by it. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate. The habit of creating structure when situations become unclear deserves careful examination because it is one of the most consistently useful and most consistently underdeveloped capabilities in any collaborative environment. When situations lose clarity, when goals become ambiguous, when roles are uncertain, when the process forward is genuinely unclear, groups experience a particular kind of productive paralysis. Everyone is aware of the problem. No one is certain about the path forward. The result is often a diffuse, anxious energy that generates discussion without generating progress. The person who can walk into this condition and create working structure, not perfect structure, not the final answer, but enough clarity to allow coordinated movement, performs a function that is immediately and obviously valuable to everyone involved. They make something possible that was not possible a moment before, and the willingness to do this, to accept the responsibility of providing direction under conditions of genuine uncertainty, is not something most people move toward naturally. Most people wait for someone else to provide the structure, because providing it means accepting partial accountability for the outcomes it produces. The person who consistently moves toward this responsibility, rather than away from it, builds a track record that accumulates into genuine leadership credibility over time. Not because they were always right. No one is always right in genuinely uncertain situations. But because they were consistently willing to engage with the difficulty rather than waiting for someone else to resolve it. This willingness is its own form of competence, distinct from having the correct answer, and it is recognized as such by the people who benefit from it. Most people overlook this habit, the quiet confidence that develops through disciplined habits over time is different in both quality and source from the confidence most people recognize. The most visible forms of confidence are performative. They announce themselves through assertion, through volume, through the social signals of certainty. They often develop through the practice of appearing confident before confidence has been earned by competence and experience. This kind of confidence is socially effective in some contexts, particularly in contexts where the audience has no way to assess the underlying substance, but it is fragile. Under genuine pressure, or in the presence of people who can assess the substance accurately, it tends to fail. The confidence that develops from disciplined habit is different. It is quieter, in most cases. It does not announce itself with the same vigor, but it is also substantially more stable because it is grounded in an accurate self-assessment. The person with this kind of confidence knows what they know and what they do not know. They know which of their judgments to trust and which to hold more lightly. They know, from accumulated experience, how they perform under pressure, how they handle uncertainty, how they behave when they are wrong. There are no illusions to maintain. The confidence is grounded in actual self-knowledge, which means it does not require external confirmation and does not collapse under challenge. This kind of confidence produces a particular quality of presence. The person is not performing certainty. They are simply operating from an accurate base. They can acknowledge uncertainty without it destabilizing them, because their confidence is not based on the claim of certainty. They can be challenged without becoming defensive, because the challenge is engaging an actual position, not a socially constructed identity. They can change their minds when the evidence warrants it, because their confidence is in their own process, not in any particular conclusion. Over time, people in proximity to this kind of confidence begin to orient toward it, not because it is forceful, but because it is reliable. In a landscape of performances, the person who is simply what they appear to be, whose private competence matches their public presentation, stands out in a way that is difficult to explain, but immediately felt. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate. The way a person handles conflict, not avoids it, but handles it, reveals more about their long-term leadership capacity than almost any other observable behavior. Conflict in groups is inevitable. Differences of perspective, competing interests, disagreements about direction, interpersonal friction. These are not failures of a group's functioning. They are features of it. Any group pursuing anything genuinely difficult will experience conflict as a regular occurrence. The question is not whether it will arise, but how it will be handled when it does. Most people have a default response to conflict that falls somewhere on a spectrum between avoidance and escalation. The avoider withdraws from the tension, finds reasons to delay engagement with the disagreement, and allows issues to accumulate unresolved until they become significantly more damaging than they would have been had they been addressed early. The escalator engages aggressively, treats disagreement as combat, and focuses on winning the argument rather than resolving the underlying problem. Neither of these responses serves the group well. Avoidance allows problems to compound. Escalation damages relationships and creates defensiveness that makes actual resolution harder, not easier. The person who develops a third approach, who can engage with conflict directly and early while maintaining a genuine orientation toward resolution rather than victory, provides an enormous service to any group they operate in. This approach requires several habits working together. The willingness to address tension directly, rather than wait for it to resolve itself. The ability to maintain composure while engaging with disagreement. The discipline to remain focused on the underlying issue rather than the interpersonal dynamic. The skill to communicate one's own position clearly while remaining genuinely open to understanding the other position more fully. And the patience to work through conflict at the pace the situation requires, rather than at the pace one's own discomfort demands. The person who brings this approach to conflict consistently becomes someone else's turn to when conflicts arise. Not to referee them, necessarily, but to help navigate them. Their presence in difficult interpersonal situations changes what is possible, and their willingness to engage conflict directly, rather than allowing it to fester, creates an environment in which problems are addressed at a size where they remain manageable, rather than allowed to grow to a size where they become organizational crises. And this is where influence begins to deepen into something more durable than any title or position conveys, but something else quietly shapes leadership over time. The long-term orientation of consistently effective leaders is one of the most persistently distinguishing features of their thinking, and one of the most difficult habits to develop in an environment that systematically rewards the short term, the immediate environment, the performance review, the quarterly result, the visible project. The current relationship provides the feedback that shapes most people's decisions. When the feedback you receive is short-term, the decisions you make tend to be short-term, even when a more considered perspective would identify longer-term approaches as clearly superior. This is not poor reasoning. It is a logical response to the incentive structure actually present. The person who maintains a long-term orientation in this environment is making a particular kind of choice. They are accepting that some of the behavior most valuable for long-term outcomes will not be rewarded immediately and may not be visible to others for extended periods. The relationship they are investing in will not produce a return this quarter. The skill they are developing will not be demonstrably useful for months or years. The reputation they are building through consistent reliability will not be fully recognized until circumstances arise that test it. Most people are not able to sustain this kind of investment without visible feedback. The discipline required to continue building toward outcomes that are distant and uncertain in the presence of immediate pressures that demand attention is significant, but the people who develop it gain a compounding advantage that eventually becomes very large. Their skills are deeper, their relationships are more trusted, their judgment is sharper, their reputation is more established. The gap between their capacity and that of their peers, who have been continuously optimizing for the immediate feedback cycle, becomes increasingly difficult to close. This long-term orientation also changes how they evaluate decisions that appear to conflict between short-term cost and long-term benefit. They are more willing to absorb a short-term cost of difficulty, of discomfort, of social friction, in service of a long-term outcome they understand clearly and trust. This willingness is not impractical idealism. It is strategic clarity about how advantage actually accumulates over time. There is another behavior that often separates those who lead from those who simply participate: the habit of continuous learning, not as an occasion-specific response to a skill gap, but as a sustained, ongoing practice, is something that appears consistently among the people who improve throughout their careers rather than plateauing after initial competence is established. Plateauing is the default. Most people develop the skills required for their current function to a level of basic competence and then stop actively developing. They are busy. The immediate demands of their role consume their available time. The skills they have are sufficient to maintain current performance. The investment required to develop further does not produce an obvious immediate return, and so the active learning gradually becomes passive, then stops altogether. The person who maintains active learning as an ongoing practice builds a compounding advantage in capability that, over years, becomes very large. Their understanding of their domain deepens in ways that produce qualitatively different insights than their initial competence allowed. Their exposure to adjacent fields creates connections that produce novel thinking. Their continuous engagement with their own development means that when the environment changes, when new demands arise, when the field shifts, when existing approaches become insufficient, they have the resources to adapt without having to rebuild from scratch. This learning also produces a particular quality in how they engage with ideas and problems. They are genuinely curious in a way that has not been replaced by the assumption of expertise. They ask questions in areas where their title would allow them to claim authority. They acknowledge what they do not understand, rather than managing the appearance of comprehensive knowledge, and this intellectual honesty makes the people around them more willing to engage openly, to share actual uncertainties, to raise genuine questions, to work through real problems, rather than performing the appearance of competence. Most people overlook this habit. How consistently effective leaders build trust is worth examining as a specific process, rather than as a general character attribute. Trust is not granted based on first impressions. It is not produced by persuasion or by the performance of trustworthiness. It is built through accumulated experience over time. Every interaction in which someone behaves in a way that matches their stated values adds a small increment to the trust others have in them. Every interaction in which their behavior diverges from their stated values removes a significant amount of that accumulated credit. The asymmetry is important. Trust builds slowly and erodes quickly. A pattern of reliable, honest, consistent behavior developed over years can be significantly damaged by a small number of conspicuous failures. This means that the discipline required to build trust is not only the discipline of positive behavior, of doing what you say, of being honest, of following through, but also the discipline of consistency across conditions, maintaining standards when it is convenient and abandoning them under pressure does not produce a reputation for trustworthiness. It produces a reputation for conditional reliability, which is much less valuable. The person who understands this treats their credibility as a long-term asset that requires consistent maintenance. They do not make exceptions to their own standards when the immediate pressure makes exceptions seem reasonable, because they understand that each exception is not an isolated event. It is a data point in the ongoing record by which others are forming their assessment. And that assessment, compounded over time, determines the level of trust and consequently the level of influence they will eventually hold. This is patient work. It does not produce visible results in any single interaction, but over the course of a year, or 3 years, or a decade, the person who has consistently maintained their standards and followed through on their commitments occupies a fundamentally different position in their environment than the person who has not. The difference is not always formally recognized. Often it is not, but it is felt. People know who they can trust with genuinely important things, and that knowledge shapes the informal allocation of responsibility, influence, and opportunity in ways that no formal process fully captures. And this is where the fullness of what has been described begins to come together. The habits explored throughout this narration are not separate practices. They are deeply interconnected. Clear thinking produces clear communication. Clear communication builds trust. Trust enables honest relationships. Honest relationships provide accurate feedback. Accurate feedback accelerates learning. Deeper learning improves judgment. Better judgment produces more reliable decisions. More reliable decisions strengthen accountability. Consistent accountability deepens trust further. Each habit reinforces the others, and because they reinforce each other, the person who develops even a few of them tends to develop the rest over time, because the environment they create around themselves makes the remaining habits easier to practice. The relationships they build, because of their reliability and honesty, provide the support and honest feedback that makes continued development possible. The reputation they develop, because of their consistent composure and accountability, creates conditions in which they have more influence and therefore more opportunity to practice the habits that require actual stakes to develop. This compounding does not happen quickly. It is genuinely a long-term process. The individual habits are each, in themselves, modest. The decision to pause before responding in one meeting changes very little. The decision to acknowledge one mistake honestly changes very little. The consistent preparation for one additional period of learning changes very little. But the accumulation of these modest habits, practiced day after day over years, produces a compounding transformation in capability and in how others perceive and relate to the person practicing them. It is also worth noting what these habits are not, and what the absence of certain popular notions of leadership reveals about the nature of the real thing. Leadership is commonly associated with charisma, with the magnetic quality that draws attention and generates enthusiasm. Charisma is real, and it is useful. But it is also frequently decoupled from the habits that actually produce effective leadership. The charismatic person who cannot follow through reliably, who becomes reactive under pressure, who deflects accountability, who listens poorly, because they are primarily focused on their own expression. This person may attract followers initially, but does not retain genuine trust over time. The social energy dissipates when the results do not follow. Leadership is commonly associated with decisiveness, with the ability to make fast decisions with apparent confidence. Decisiveness is useful, but the decisiveness that generates genuine credibility is decisiveness grounded in prepared judgment, not the performance of certainty in the absence of actual thought. The person who decides quickly because they have developed accurate pattern recognition through years of careful learning and honest self-examination produces very different outcomes, and the person who decides quickly because they are uncomfortable with uncertainty and want to relieve it as fast as possible. Leadership is commonly associated with ambition, with the drive to reach the highest available positions. Ambition is a fuel, but ambition without the disciplined habits that produce genuine capability and genuine trust tends to produce people who rise through environments where appearance is prioritized and fall when substance is required. The person who develops the real habits, who focuses on becoming genuinely capable and genuinely trustworthy, often advances because the capabilities are recognized, not because they were primarily focused on advancement. Real leadership is built from the inside out, not from the position down, and that is why it is so often invisible in its development and so unmistakable in its eventual expression. In many situations, leadership does not begin when someone receives a title or formal responsibility. It begins much earlier, in circumstances where no one would think to use the word leadership at all. It begins in how a person handles a small misunderstanding, in whether they take the time to prepare for a conversation that could have been managed unprepared, in whether they acknowledge a mistake or quietly absorb it into the past, in whether they actually listen to what someone is saying or perform attention while preparing their next statement. These are not dramatic choices. They carry no obvious significance in the moment, but they are the choices that form the habits, and habits, formed through consistent repetition over time, shape character. Character, expressed through behavior across all conditions and circumstances, produces reputation, and reputation, the accumulated record of how a person has behaved when it mattered and when it did not, is the actual foundation on which real influence is built. The individuals who lead effectively, who hold the genuine trust and genuine respect of others, not because they hold authority over them, but because their presence actually makes the work better, have usually been practicing the relevant habits for far longer than their formal role would indicate. The promotion or the appointment or the recognition comes later. The development came first, and it came quietly, through daily choices that were rarely visible and rarely dramatic and rarely recognized as significant by anyone, including, often, the person making them. But the choices compound, the habits deepen, the reputation builds, and at some point, not through a single moment, but through the accumulated weight of consistent behavior over time, the person is genuinely prepared to lead in the fullest sense, not because they were given authority, because they earned trust. The difference between those two things, between authority given and trust earned, is the difference between managing compliance and genuinely leading. Authority can be assigned in a moment. Trust cannot. Trust is the product of time and consistency and integrity and quiet, steady competence demonstrated across the full range of ordinary circumstances that no one pays particular attention to in the moment. Leadership begins in those circumstances, in the ordinary moments that shape habits, in the habits that shape character, in the character that, over time, shapes what others believe about who you are and what you can be trusted with. It does not begin with a title. It does not begin with an announcement. It does not begin when someone places you in front of a group and asks you to lead. It begins in the small, daily, largely invisible choices about how to think, how to speak, how to listen, how to respond to failure, how to maintain standards when standards are inconvenient, how to remain composed when circumstances are difficult. Those choices, repeated long enough, become the person, and the person, formed by those choices, becomes the one others naturally turn toward when direction matters and trust is required. That is how leadership is built, quietly, gradually, through habits practiced long before anyone is watching.